Many airlines are built on low cost and leisure, other on business and loyalty programs. Some, though, have safety not only at the core of their operations, but as a part of their identity as a whole. So what happened when, on a tropical, stormy night, certain events not only put lives at risk, but brought the identity of an entire major airline to the brink of collapse? Welcome to Bangkok International Airport, one of the biggest aviation hubs in Southeast Asia, and also one of the oldest international airports in the world. The time is 10:35 PM on the 23rd of September 1999. As always, the parallel runways are in operation, 21 right being used for departing aircraft and 21 left for arrivals. At this time of year, Bangkok experiences the passage of the Intertropical Convergence Zone, otherwise known as the wet season. September is renowned for producing some of the most severe and frequent storms of the year. Therefore, to assist pilots as they approach the airport, the PAPIs and the high-intensity approach lighting have been switched on. If we jump on board an arriving aircraft, we can see exactly how these lights aid the pilots in limited visibility. They can descend down most of their approach using only their instruments, but at the decision height, they need to transition their eyes outside. Therefore, the Precision Approach Path Indicators, or PAPIs, confirm to the pilots that they are on the correct glide slope, by appearing as 2 white lights and 2 reds. Getting high changes the pilot's perspective of the PAPIs, and more lights become white, while too low means more red. Stretching out from the threshold are the high-intensity approach lights, which help the pilots with their lateral tracking, guiding them accurately all the way to the runway centerline. With the arrivals at Bangkok in full swing, and the rain beginning to pick up, the ungrooved runway is going from dry to damp to wet, causing landing distances to increase. So let's see how the aircraft stop every single time, safely. It all starts with a stable approach. This involves not only maintaining glide slope and localizer, but also the pilots flying at the appropriate speed. This speed, known as VREF, is determined during the landing distance calculations. It's critical that VREF is maintained accurately, as excess speed means excess energy, particularly in heavy aircraft, where even a few extra knots on the approach can mean hundreds of extra meters at the other end. Once the plane touches down, there are 3 forces utilized to stop it. The whole aircraft generates aerodynamic drag, but the flaps are specifically designed to create as much as possible when landing, while allowing the aircraft to land at a lower speed in the first place. Spoilers add to the drag by sticking up out of the wing, while also doing exactly what their name suggests, spoiling the lift. This gets the plane's full weight onto the wheels, allowing the brakes to be as effective as possible. However, as the runway becomes increasingly wet, they become less efficient. Thus the third stopping force comes into play, reverse thrust. The pilots selected after touchdown, causing the engines to redirect their airflow forwards, providing a high proportion of the aircraft's stopping force on wet runways. The next 2 aircraft to arrive will be a pair of Qantas Boeing 747s, but before we join them, let's take a listen into the tower to hear the updated weather.
All stations, information uniform is current. Aerodrome visibility is reducing to 1500 meters. Runway 21 right RVR is 750 meters.
A thunderstorm, producing heavy rain, is approaching the airport, creating challenging landing conditions for the aircraft on approach. For reasons that will become clear later, let's focus in on the second aircraft. It's Qantas 1 arriving from Sydney, a Boeing 747 with 391 passengers on board, 16 cabin crew, and in the flight deck, 3 pilots. They include a 49-year-old captain acting as pilot monitoring, 36-year-old first officer who is doing the flying on this approach, and a 35-year-old second officer. All are experienced pilots at Qantas. The captain also holds a senior management position at the company, meaning that he flies approximately 1/3 of the hours per month compared to his colleagues. Qantas is known in Australia and around the world as one of the safest airlines in the world. It hasn't had one fatal crash or loss of an aircraft in the jet age, a record virtually unmatched by any other airline. But what we'll see on this flight is this record being put to the test. Qantas 1 is currently descending through 7,000 feet, having just received information uniform, illustrating the deteriorating but not unusual conditions at Bangkok.
Happy to select the first stage of flaps?
Yep, sure. Flaps 1 please.
Speed checked, flaps 1.
Flaps 1 is the first setting of 7 flap increments. As the speed of the aircraft comes back, the pilots will further increase their position. On this approach, they're planning to land with flaps set to 25, auto brake set to 3, but with no reverse thrust. We'll see later how this will have a dramatic impact upon landing.
Flaps 5.
Roger, speed checked, flaps 5.
Qantas 1 intercepts the glide slope, and the autopilot captures it, commencing descent to the runway. The role of the pilots is to monitor the autopilot and manage the thrust and configuration of the aircraft to ensure that it's stable by 1,000 feet, as per company procedures.
Qantas 1, contact Bangkok Tower at the final approach point.
Roger, tower at the final approach point. Qantas 1, g'day.
Flaps 10.
Speed checked, flaps 10.
The crew have been instructed to contact Bangkok Tower at the final approach point, otherwise known as the outer marker for the ILS approach. It's currently still 3 miles away, so the pilots don't hear the following events occurring on the tower frequency.
Tower, Qantas 15 is going around.
Qantas 15, roger. Fly heading 210.
Heading 210, Qantas 15.
Qantas 15, a company 747, has just commenced a missed approach. They almost made it to the runway in clear conditions, but on short final, encountered extremely heavy rain, reducing visibility so much that the pilots lost sight of the runway and decided to go around. Meanwhile, through 2,700 feet and still in the cloud, the crew of Qantas 1 extend the landing gear, with the speed up at 201 knots. Through 2,200 feet, the first officer disengages the autopilot.
Autopilot is off.
Okay,
Just getting some hands-on time while I can.
all good, mate.
Flaps 20.
Okay, speed checked, flaps 20.
Flaps 25.
Speed checked, flaps 25. Bangkok Tower, Qantas 1.
Qantas 1, caution. Runway wet and braking action reported by Airbus 33 is good. Wind 260 degrees at 11 knots. Cleared to land runway 21 left.
Okay, 21 left, cleared to land, Qantas 1.
The Qantas 1 crew are still unaware of the preceding 747's missed approach. They're assuming the Airbus mentioned by Tower, an A330 which landed successfully, was the aircraft ahead of them.
Landing checklist, please.
Landing checklist, speed brakes.
Armed.
Landing gear.
Down 3 greens.
Flaps.
25.
The landing checklist is complete, and the aircraft is fully configured for landing at Bangkok. At no stage during the descent or approach has the use of reverse thrust or flaps 30 been mentioned, with flaps 25 and idle thrust the norm within the Qantas procedures for landings. The crew don't believe that a different configuration is appropriate given the information available to them. The aircraft breaks out of the cloud and the lights of Bangkok come into view.
You see it?
Yep. Visual procedures.
There's still a heavy rain shower on the approach to the runway. Meanwhile, the speed is still hanging 12 knots above VREF. The first officer needs to start bringing it back.
Doesn't want to slow down.
Yep, you're good.
Light drops begin to fall on the windscreen as Qantas 1 enters the rain.
Windscreen wipers on.
They're on, set to high.
The rain has increased drastically. It's heavier than any of the pilots have ever seen before, further increasing the workload on the first officer. His descent rate reduces, and the plane begins deviating above the glide slope.
You're getting high now. You happy?
Yeah.
A runway overrun is when an aircraft cannot land within the available stopping distance. It will be the result of a series of events which is about to occur. But with it all happening within a particularly short amount of time, we're going to slow the accident sequence down to see exactly why the overrun will occur. At approximately 76 feet, the aircraft crosses the threshold of runway 21 left, 32 feet above the ideal threshold crossing height. Speed is 169 knots, now 20 knots above VREF.
Sink. Don't sink.
Get it down. Come on, you're starting your flare.
Don't sink.
Check.
Don't sink. Don't sink.
With the aircraft floating down the runway, the captain increases the auto brake setting to 4, but does not advise his fellow crew members.
Go around.
Not happy with the float or the reduced visibility, the captain has elected to go around. The first officer pushes the thrust levers forward to begin the go-around procedure.
30, 20, 10.
At this critical moment, the 747's main gear has touched down. Simultaneously, the rain completely clears. So without verbal indication, and quickly assessing that there is enough runway to stop, the captain has decided to continue the landing rather than go around. He's placed his hand over the first officers and sharply retarded the number 2, 3, and 4 thrust levers to idle, inadvertently leaving the number 1 thrust lever in its advanced position.
Okay, we're on.
Got it?
The FO notices the number 1 thrust lever and pulls it back. The spoiler logic allows them to be deployed. However, none of the crew notice that the auto brake has been disarmed, caused by its logic deactivating the system when a thrust lever is advanced for more than 3 seconds. The plane is now almost halfway down the runway, still hurtling at 158 knots.
Yeah, I've got it.
Finally, someone has started manually braking, and with the end of the runway now in sight, both the captain and first officer are soon applying max brakes. Due to the water-saturated, ungrooved runway though, the brakes have little effect. The tyres of the 747 begin aquaplaning, effectively floating along the runway surface on a cushion of water, reducing the brake effectiveness to just 1/3 of their usual performance. And with no reverse thrust being utilised, it's now clear that the jumbo jet is going to overshoot the runway. At 88 knots, it crosses the end of the paved surface, collides with the ILS antenna, enters an area of soft soil, and finally comes to a stop 200 metres past the end of the runway.
Alright, we're stopped.
Shut down checklist actions. Fuel control, idle cutoff.
Back behind the flight deck, the cabin service manager's welcome to Bangkok PA is interrupted as he senses a rather abnormal landing roll. Some of the crew members adopt the brace position as the cabin lights fail and emergency lighting illuminates. The cabin crew and pilots soon discover that the interphones throughout the cabin are also not working. The first officer calls the tower to advise of the overrun, while the second officer relays instructions between the captain and the cabin. They discuss the possibility of an evacuation, but decide it's not necessary, even with emergency services arriving immediately. They decide to make arrangements for a precautionary disembarkation. Several minutes later, passengers begin emerging down the steps and onto awaiting buses. No major injuries are reported, though 38 passengers report some form of minor injury, with 15 volunteering information of psychological distress. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau examined in detail the landing performance of Qantas 1. Looking back, the pilot elected to land with flaps 25 and idle reverse thrust, calculating but not fully accounting for the wet, ungrooved runway. The ATSB determined that the appropriate landing configuration would have been with flaps 30 and full reverse thrust. If this was the case, a landing with lower speed, more aerodynamic drag, and less reliance on the brake would have prevented the aquaplaning and the overrun. Also critical were the confusing seconds where the shared mental model of the crew split up. Both pilots had different and changing ideas of the primary goal to be achieved, thus showing why clear and decisive communication is essential during critical stages of flight. The 747, which ended up on Hole 3 at the Royal Thai Air Force Golf Course, did, in fact, fly again, perilously craned out of what could have been its final resting place, and repaired to the tune of a $200 million price tag. Qantas was reportedly desperate to keep its remarkable safety record of no hull losses intact. So it could be said that the legacy of this accident had the potential to be much worse, had the highly marketed reputation of Qantas been destroyed. But records are simply words on paper, and the safety of an airline is not determined by the marketing department. Lessons learned and recommendations implemented are what's paramount to safety in aviation, many of which occurred after Qantas 1, allowing every subsequent Qantas landing and all landings around the world to be even safer than ever before.